Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality. I'm your host, Doc Bach, here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are wrapping up our series on obsessive compulsive personality. This checklist-loving, cold and chilly type can seem robotic, and so can the very detached schizoid personality. The two have some surprising overlaps as well as some clear differences. We're going to compare and contrast the two by looking at core drives, desires, and motives underlying their chilly exterior. So let's jump in. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder doesn't have many differential diagnoses, as it's fairly obvious. That said, it co-occurs with every other personality disorder, which can be a little confusing when you have the personality blends and layers. But OCPD characteristics really don't look like other personality disorders usually.
Right. And the literature only really covers two that maybe could be mistaken as OCPD: narcissistic personality and schizoid personality disorder.
Aha.
So we are going to focus on the overlap between OCPD and schizoid because schizoid is one of our favorite.
Yes.
But before we jump in, let's briefly go over the criteria for OCPD and schizoid personality disorder.
Of course. So in OCPD, we see an extreme preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control at the expense of flexibility and efficiently completing tasks. They often miss the forest for the trees and will spin their wheels making checklists or rewriting things, but they often lose sight of the main task and it may not get accomplished at all. But there is a lot of energy wasted in compulsively checking the box and rewriting the things, etc.
And as with all personality disorders, these traits don't just show up one day. It's not only present during one setting, like in college. It's intertwined with who you are as a person. Other criteria include being super detail-oriented, problematically perfectionistic, workaholism, inflexibility, rigidity, hoarding, and being controlling, financially stingy, and stubborn.
Now, as for the DSM version of schizoid, criteria include social detachment and restricted emotional expression, plus not wanting, enjoying, and or lacking close relationships, a lack of interest in intimacy with someone else, choosing solitary activities, and not feeling pleasure in life, and then also appearing indifferent to praise or criticism and showing emotional coldness, detachment, or flattened affectivity.
Now, the psychodynamic schizoid goes a layer deeper and talks about how schizoids actually are concerned with being consumed or engulfed, which leads to their detached nature. We'll get into this a little bit more, but for now, we'll stick with the DSM. So on that note, what does the DSM say about the overlap between OCPD and schizoid?
Well, the DSM only differentiates OCPD from 3 other personality disorders, which really isn't a lot, especially considering one of them is antisocial personality disorder, which is really weird to me because antisocial and OCPD has the lowest co-occurrence, so they are total opposites. The antisocial goes against the social grain, and the compulsive has a death grip on the social grain or the social script. So it's really rare to see those two things together. So it does feel like a no duh DSM moment.
I actually think they might only include that because antisocials and OCPD can lack generosity, but antisocials do spend money on themselves. OCPD individuals, they don't spend money, period.
Right. So maybe that's why, like the relationship with money, but their motives are very different. But the second differential is narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissists can also lack generosity, but they will indulge themselves, of course, because they're entitled and deserving of all the greatest things. Narcissists may also be perfectionistic and think others can't do things as well as they can. But narcissists believe they have actually achieved perfection and superiority, while those with OCPD are very self-critical and they are still striving to attain perfection. But there is a whiff of narcy in OCPD, And especially as we've been talking about with every series here, narcissism is present in every single personality disorder.
No, the third personality differential in the DSM is schizoid. So schizoid and OCPD can look formal and detached socially, but those with OCPD have a discomfort with emotions and an excessive focus on work, while those with schizoid personality disorder struggle with intimacy due to fears of intrusion.
Yes. Now, also those with OCPD have more energy than schizoids who have a hard time getting moving. Compulsives frivolously spend energy working. Interesting, though, that they conserve money, which I think is fascinating. But schizoids tend to conserve their energy, or they lack energy.
The DSM focuses on schizoids by describing essentially what they lack, but not actually what they are. So it describes the turtle shell, but not the turtle inside.
Right. So the psychodynamic approach highlights the rich inner world of the schizoid and their focus on fantasy to avoid engulfment. So this is very different from a deficits-based approach in the DSM. So with that, let's jump to our favorite psychodynamic shrink, Dr. Nancy McWilliams.
McWilliams offers some refreshing clarity about the difference between schizoid and OCPD. She notes that some obsessional personalities can look schizoid on the outside, but they actually might be regressed obsessional personalities. So by regress, she means like closer to the borderline psychotic range of organization, or basically a personality that is unhealthy and backsliding.
Ooh.
So obsessional individuals at that unhealthy level isolate their affect, which is a defense mechanism. So they basically separate out emotion and then only use cognition like so incessantly that they look schizoid. Schizoids withdraw from the external world, but they're usually conscious of their internal fantasies and intense emotions. Meanwhile, a withdrawn obsessional person actually isolates from their emotions so completely that they can appear like blank or wooden.
Yeah, so schizoids don't lack affect. They just don't show it to you. They actually are more concerned with being overwhelmed by affect, so they withdraw into their turtle shell, into fantasy. So someone with more severe OCPD, though, has completely disconnected from their emotions and desires. They've suppressed them, pushed them out of conscious awareness, which is why they rigidly adhere to rules, scripts, work, etc., lest those desires and emotions seep out. So technically, those with schizoid and OCPD can look the same on the outside at first glance. Oh, like they aren't emoting, right? But if you get to know either one, I guarantee you can see the difference pretty clearly.
I'll quote McWilliams here. The prevalent misconception of a schizoid person as unfeeling may be based on observations of regressed obsessional people who have become wooden and robotic. So deep is the gulf between their cognition and emotion.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So in relationships and in therapy, it's important to understand the difference between OCPD and schizoid so you know how to relate to the individual. So for the schizoid, you want to convey that it's safe to express their inner workings. It's safe for them to come out of their turtle shell and show you a glimpse of their inner world.
For the individual with OCPD, you actually want to communicate that like it must be so terrible to feel cold and dead inside.
Ooh, that's interesting. Say more about that.
So I feel like the OCPD person pushes down their humanness. So because humans are imperfect and messy and have some unacceptable urges, they like lock it in a box that they reject. But humanness is also beautiful and passionate and creative. It's life.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they throw out all the colors in the crayon box and only use black and white, maybe sometimes gray. And then it's like, how painful and horrible and sad is that?
Yeah. So you're relating to them by gently naming and empathizing with how drab and cold their life is. But even in this empathy statement, they may not accept it because it would require them to like lift their compulsive lid, even just a crack, to peer into the emotions they feel inside that they've constricted. So again, the schizoid and the individual with OCPD can look chilly and robotic on the outside. And if the schizoid doesn't let you into their inner world, they may still look like they have OCPD because all you see is that restricted affect, which, side note, this is also why it's so important to spend time with patients before assigning a diagnosis, because things are not always as they seem to be. And people are very, very complex. And that's why I love psychological testing. This is also a plug for psych testing.
People are very complex. And also, those with OCPD and schizoid have very, very different inner needs. So let's look at how Psychodynamic describes the key features of OCPD and the key features of schizoid in the PDM-2. So, starting at the beginning with temperament and growth in childhood, every kiddo is born with a different temperament.
Yep.
So, OCPD child may be more likely to have aggression and irritability and orderliness.
Yep. So they may be stubborn and hard to soothe as infants. And definitely as potty training and toddlerhood approaches, you might see more power struggles and withholding their stools.
In contrast, the schizoid child is highly sensitive, shy, and overstimulated.
So even as infants, they might shy away from light or sound or touch. And by elementary school age, they may struggle with class presentations or being put on the spot in front of their peers.
So temperament shows up early on, and it can give us clues about personality, and there are patterns that develop, such as proneness to certain feelings. Internally, emotional experiences can also help us differentiate between schizoid and OCPD.
Yep. So internally, they both deal with different main emotions. So for the OCPD, they experience anger, guilt, anxiety, shame, and fear. So it's there, but they isolate from it, which we'll get to again soon. So they suppress their emotions, and their compulsivity serves to push it down even further from awareness. But underneath that rigid, controlled shell is these negative emotions, which leads to the self-punishing lifestyle that they live, basically devoid of any enjoyment.
For the schizoid, they experience general emotional pain when overstimulated because remember, they're highly sensitive.
Yeah.
So McWilliams notes that their emotion can be so powerful that they feel like they have to suppress it.
Yep. So schizoids can be overwhelmed by emotions easily, leading them to turtle in or suppress them or even intellectualize them. But they don't deny emotions or moralize them like compulsives do. But how do these personalities handle all these emotions and conflicts and thoughts?
They use defense mechanisms. So in OCPD, they tend to use isolation of affect, reaction formation, intellectualizing, moralizing, and undoing.
So isolation of affect is basically splitting off emotions from conscious awareness. They're buried. They don't exist. They do, but they don't to the OCPD individual. Now, reaction formation is taking an unacceptable desire and turning it into something acceptable, like a person with sadistic urges becomes a surgeon using their desires for good. Now, intellectualizing is running emotions through an intellectual filter so they don't feel as much and rationalize it away. And then moralizing is justifying desires and behavior in the name of religion or ethics or morality. And basically, undoing is a compulsion. So an action that serves to cancel out an impulse.
Meanwhile, the schizoid person tends to utilize withdrawal.
Yeah,
that's their main one. No, there's more than one, but that's their main one. So this can be physical. So like literally going away to be in their turtle shell, whatever that is. It can be withdrawal into fantasy and peculiar thoughts. They can also withdraw from their emotions under stress. So feeling really, really intensely on the inside, but looking flat on the outside. They also do tend to use intellectualization, but they don't use defenses that sort emotions dichotomously. So like good or bad, because they take all the things in, all the perspectives. So nothing could be as simple as being either good or bad.
Right, because they see that life has nuances, because schizoids utilize all the colors of the Crayola box. And those with OCPD maybe only use black, white, and occasionally gray. But question, what are the maladaptive or unhelpful core beliefs about the self that lead to these defense mechanisms? Like, What are we defending and why?
Yeah, so all personalities have core beliefs that may or may not be conscious. So the OCPD individual holds the belief that most feelings are dangerous and therefore must be controlled.
Oh, how dare you be messy and have socially inappropriate impulses? It's unacceptable to be human.
Yes, and then meanwhile, the schizoid individual holds a belief that dependency and love are dangerous.
Yeah, so it's the concern about the self in relation to others versus fearing what is inside the self.
But schizoids don't believe that most emotions are dangerous, just connection with others because it could threaten their separation to be themselves.
Yeah. And schizoids don't usually feel that emotions need to be controlled like those with OCPD, maybe just managed. So the emotion, or the person evoking the emotion, doesn't overpower them. So these beliefs played out can look very similar on the surface, but not at the core. But let's move to maladaptive or unhelpful core beliefs about others. So what are the similarities and differences here between OCPD and schizoid?
Sure. So the OCPD individual holds a belief that others are less precise and in control. And so then they have to control what they do and resist being controlled by others. It is all about control and expanding their self-control and self-constraint to include the same standards for others.
Wonder if subconsciously they are concerned about others blowing their cover, like exposing what the compulsivity serves to hide. So maybe others should be controlled too, lest their deepest desires and emotions be outed.
That is an interesting thought. Yeah, but the schizoid doesn't actually want to control others. They probably don't even have the energy to control others. And then they would actually have to depend on the other person to even engage in control, which leads to their core belief: the social world is impinging and dangerously engulfing.
Yes, which is why they hide in their turtle shell, because it's too overwhelming, so they detach. Or they can't even put forth the energy to be overwhelmed, so they just detach and withdraw. They wouldn't dream of controlling another person. But wait a minute, as I'm saying that, they actually would dream or fantasize about it, but they would never do it because it's way better in the fantasy anyway.
That's hilarious. Yep, schizoids can have some dark thoughts.
They can indeed. And I love schizoids for it. I love that they can go there. It's authentic. But I think we had one more difference according to the PDM. So schizoids and those with OCPD have differing internal conflicts.
Yeah, so the OCPD person struggles with all that control, feeling a need to submit to an authority versus rebel against a controlling authority.
Yeah. So it's the conflict of, do I comply or do I defy? They choose compliance by suppressing the rebellious spirit, but it sometimes pops up to the surface in passive-aggressive ways.
Exactly. And in contrast, the schizoid is preoccupied with the fear of closeness versus yearning for closeness. They're not interested in control. They are trying to navigate their desire to connect with someone, but also their intense concern that connection will lead to engulfment and they'll lose that separation. Schizoids don't necessarily feel active fear. It's more of this passive, protective, freeze, move away response, detach.
Yeah. The Simpson gif, back away into the bushes.
Yes, that one.
With that, let's look at Millon because he had some interesting things to say as per usual. So Millon describes a schizoid personality with compulsive features, and he also describes a compulsive personality with schizoid and avoidant features in his subtypes.
Okay, so let's start at the affectless schizoid subtype. So this is a schizoid personality, and the subtype is often more severe and at disorder level with compulsive features involving emotional deficits that impact their ability to connect or relate with others.
So here is the overlap between compulsive and schizoids. But McWilliams advocates that the schizoid detaches from emotions rather than having emotional deficits.
Exactly. These schizoids are isolated and detached from all their emotions, so they come off as chilly and spiritless, uncaring, perhaps unresponsive, unperturbed. Their indifference isn't antisocial or cruel, but paired with compulsive traits like emotional constriction and formality, it can definitely lead to little or no emotional expression.
Yeah. So their compulsive features mean that they can enjoy more structured settings and may find an adaptive place in society or in a job where they can follow a conventional script and don't have to emote, like sitting behind a computer that doesn't pull like a person does.
Ooh, or like maybe being in cybersecurity because then they're like protecting others from intrusion.
Bingo. I love that. That is so true. Yeah. So, other schizoids at the disorder level can have difficulty functioning at work or getting started. But when a schizoid has some compulsive features, it kind of gives them a little lift, like an energy boost, if you will, to complete tasks that might otherwise be challenging due to their diminished schizoid mojo.
Yeah, I think this could also speak to maybe a healthier schizoid with a compulsive shell.
Yeah.
They can detach from emotions, maybe for the purpose of working and functioning, perhaps like the master masker subtype that we made up in the Schizoid Subtypes episode.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about the master masker here too. So the blend of schizoid and OCPD traits can be adaptive and helpful sometimes, especially if the compulsive traits are maybe just a pop of color and not all encompassing, like they're adaptive.
Yeah, and the thing that makes the compulsivity a shell is that the compulsivity usually shows up in limited settings. So maybe work, school, tasks, but maybe not cleaning or hobbies or leisure activities. And it's not about control. It does not leak onto controlling others.
Right. And the compulsivity isn't to deny themselves of pleasures. It's not self-punishing like it is with a true compulsive personality. Schizoids with a compulsive shell can still experience positive things and pleasure from their fantasies. The true compulsive would never do that because entering a fantasy would require accessing the undesirable things, impulses, drives, everything the compulsive seeks to control, suppress, and hide.
And then we have the compulsive personality with schizoid features, which Millon calls the parsimoniously constricted personality subtype. So it actually combines compulsive personality with schizoid or avoidant features, which interestingly, McWilliams captures both avoidant and schizoid into schizoid.
Yeah.
It also is apparently in line with Eric Fromm's hoarding orientation, as they place a wall between the self and the external world for protection. Inside that wall, they latch tightly to their stuff to avoid any potential loss.
So their stuff can be money, possessions, and privacy. So Millon wrote that they live by the belief, what is mine, and what is yours. I will leave you alone with what you possess as long as you do likewise with mine.
Yes, they don't take, but they also don't give. They simply protect what they have, and they're pretty hypervigilant regarding the possibility that others might take their stuff. So then they tend to avoid others.
Yeah, so Millon notes that this stems from their need to carve out a safe space in childhood from parental restriction and control. So they need a little corner of the world that they can control, and then they protect against any sort of intrusion, because protecting from intrusion is actually the schizoid piece here.
Yes, it is. But schizoids protect against intrusion because they don't want to be consumed by others, and they lose their sense of separateness. In contrast, the compulsive personality protects against intrusion to avoid exposure.
Yep.
They don't want anyone to see their internal anger or rebellion or emptiness.
Yes, exactly. It's about the suppression of desires, drives, humanness in true compulsives. So schizoids at the core are in touch with their humanness and really all the ickiness of humanity. Like they can go there readily. The compulsives cannot and will not go there.
Exactly. So they are burying their desires, which they deem as bad and unacceptable, as well as their money and things and privacy. So they wall off a section of their own world to control, but they don't actually have that detachment that the schizoid does.
Yeah. And it's for different motives too. So hoarding due to concerns of engulfment and being consumed, or hoarding due to fear of exposing your own desires. Same behavior, but vastly different meanings behind it. But let's move to our thoughts. Doc Fish, what do you think the overlap and differences are with schizoid and OCPD?
Okay. I am so interested in the hoarding orientation that is prevalent in the obsessive compulsives because I think some of the schizoids might hoard things too, but it looks different. So while an obsessive compulsive hoards a ton of stuff, I think maybe schizoids might hoard more internally related resources like energy, time, information, affection, etc. Or maybe even hoard in a collection type way, like keeping photographs or writings, which maybe serves to solidify their existence as a separate being.
Ooh.
Maybe, I'm not sure. But it does remind me of the avarice in the Enneagram 5.
Yes, the Enneagram. I was thinking about that with hoarding too. So the Schizoid overlaps with the Enneagram 5, and the compulsive personality overlaps with either an unhealthy Enneagram 1 or an Enneagram 6. So if we think about hoarding using this typology instead, Enneagram 5s are greedy for knowledge. They have a voracious appetite to know and to be competent, and they hoard information so that they won't be found without knowledge. Now, the Enneagram 1 maybe can hoard, but if so, it has more to do with morality, maybe to be viewed as like extra moral for living below their means, like especially a social Enneagram 1. But the Enneagram 6 can hoard due to their fear and need for security. Like to hoard resources means you won't be without in case of a worst case scenario or natural disaster. It's security focused to manage anxiety. So even using a different typology, hoarding behavior in compulsives and schizoids have different origins.
Yes. Okay, I've seen that rigidity and compulsivity in some 6s. I think maybe especially social 6s because they want to keep their security people happy, meaning that they conform and people please, but then they don't want to be dependent. So then they have resentment towards the other people, which is technically an OCPD dynamic. And that means that they have to control themselves and others so that they can control their anxiety. But this isn't all 6s. And OCPD doesn't describe all Enneagram 1s. Yeah. And OCPD can overlap with basically all other personalities. So is OCPD actually a core personality, or is it just a shell that's hiding a core?
I have been asking myself this question the whole series. Like, is there such a thing as a pure OCPD type at the core that if you take away the compulsive shell, the center is also obsessive compulsive? I personally have never seen it in outpatient clinical practice, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But I've only seen OCPD traits with other personality disorders. And each time that compulsive shell serves to hide the deeper pathology on the inside of the personality gobstopper. So is OCPD actually a standalone diagnosis? Or does it always need a buddy?
Yeah, so I have worked with OCPD, and it's a long, long process to peel back those defensive layers. And I'm not sure I've actually seen what's underneath. But then the thing with OCPD is that they kind of are their shell. That shell is so thick because it functions to contain those bad parts of the self. And so maybe we need to ask the question, like, what flavor is the bad parts of the obsessive compulsive? But then again, they probably won't know usually because that's the rejected part that they work so hard to cover up, even to themselves.
100%. Yeah. Because to deal with their compulsivity is to unravel the entire being of the person. They must face the darkness that they've put a lid on, and the compulsive style must cease. So like their way of life is gone. In therapy, they have to have other support in place, family, friends, and of course, a gentle and very patient therapist. Otherwise, self-discovery could actually be their literal undoing.
Mic drop. Yeah. And for this reason, therapy is often slow and meticulous with compulsives. We have to be so patient as therapists, but research tells us that growth and healing is totally possible. And like most personalities, growing pains exist and healing can be hard.
Yeah, especially for the compulsive types, because they are their defenses, basically. So treatment can be extremely challenging, but also so freeing if they allow themselves to go there. But we are really curious to hear from our listeners and viewers about this. So are you a compulsive personality at the core, or would you say you have a compulsive shell? And if you are a compulsive personality at the core, what has your healing journey been like? Like, how are you making peace with your darker parts? I want to hear from you in the comments, so let us know. Okay, so today we unpacked how OCPD and Schizoid are very different personalities, but do overlap. And we hope you'll tune in for our upcoming series on histrionic personality. So don't forget to like, subscribe. It really helps out our channel. Lastly, if you're a personality nerd like us, we've got blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.